An important part of education is being able to absorb and incorporate information. Not just read and memorize, but be able to understand stuff. This is another reason why a wrong answer can be better than a right answer. Or a wrong answer can be right, and a right answer can be wrong. If all you've managed to do is memorize a set of words, then you don't understand what you're reading. I've had students. I had a student once who told me that the answer I marked as wrong on his test should have been marked right because he put what the book put. He says, look, here, it says that in the book. And what I should have said to him is, well, do you know what that means? And do you know why it's wrong? And I told you not to read that part of the book. And in class, I told you the opposite of this. Do you have any reasoning to? No, he'd read the book. He'd memorized a sentence out of the book. He wrote that sentence down in his test, and he thought that was the right answer. On the exam, I'm not really looking for my own words coming back at me. I'm not really looking for words out of the textbook coming back at me. I'm looking for understanding, demonstrating that you understand a concept. Not that you agree with it. You don't have to agree with anything in the class. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with the textbook. You don't have to agree with each other. You don't even have to agree with yourself. What I want to see is you understanding the concepts, understanding the arguments. And if you understand the concept and you understand the argument and you disagree with what I say about it, you can go ahead and say that. And if you explain why you disagree, you give me a reasonable account of why someone could disagree with what I'm saying, and it looks interesting and thoughtful and well-reasoned, that's potential for extra credit. So what I'm looking for is a demonstration of a thinking process, not the right result. So you can have for instance, a paper. How many of you have started on the Odyssey papers? It's a trick question. I know that no one has started on the Odyssey paper. Okay. Go. Start on the Odyssey paper. When you write your Odyssey paper, when I'm grading the Odyssey paper, I'll be looking for a thinking process. Your thesis, your conclusion may be completely wrong. In philosophy, there are right answers. The difference between philosophy and other academic disciplines is that sometimes that right answer is very, very hard to get to. So a philosophy class should be at least substantially, maybe half the effort should be about process, the thinking process. So you can get full credit for a paper that comes to a completely wrong conclusion as long as you demonstrate a good, reasonable, imaginative thinking process along the way. And I have been known to give a 0 to a paper that I completely agreed with, simply because, yes, the writer had the same opinions as me, but did not demonstrate a thinking process in coming to those conclusions. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
But when does it do?
It makes you smarter. I meant to put up a question, eh? All right. It may be the case that I don't finish mythos and logos today, in which case it will sort of roll over to next week. But I will expect you to read next week's reading for next week. So. Why is a stroke called a stroke? You know what a stroke is, right? Yeah, well, my dad had a stroke, and basically when someone has a stroke, they kind of go, and then they can't move the right side, or they spend months and months in rehab. They might drool a lot. Right. Why is that called a stroke? Now, language is formed by a historical process, by which I mean that there's a whole bunch of seemingly random stuff that happens, a big mess of things, big disorganized mess of happenings, and it leaves debris in its wake. You could see it as a sort of continuous bar fight. History is a continuous bar fight with drunken idiots wailing on each other, and we live among the wreckage. Now, here's the etymology of the word stroke. In ancient times, people still had strokes. It's not a new thing. It's not something that we invented in the modern age. New and better diseases. Nobody's ever promised that. You'd be standing around with someone walking down the street, and every so often, somebody would go and fall over, and they'd be knocked down, and they'd be damaged, and like, what the hell happened? Well, people needed an explanation. They wanted to explain this. What's going on? And do you know what they did? They blamed the elves. The original term for a stroke was not stroke, just stroke. It was elf stroke. Some damn elf, which is, or fairy, pixie, has taken an invisible arrow and shot it into poor George. That's why George struck. Did you hear what happened to George? Elves got him. Nowadays, we don't like to admit that we believe in elves, unless you're a Tolkien geek. So we just call it a stroke. By the way, the word stroke in this context means to hit someone. Right? With one stroke, like slapping a sword into someone or punching them, the old word for that is a stroke. Okay, I bet you're with me. Now, that's what we call a mythological explanation. And if you read Edith Hamilton's mythology, you'll see a lot of mythological explanation. Anyone know the name of the goddess of the rainbow? You should have got that. This Iris. Iris is the goddess of the rainbow. Iris makes rainbows. And then those damn leprechauns run up and stick that pot of gold right at the end. Get away from there. It's my rainbow. Wow. Anyone know the name of the goddess of chaos? Greek goddess of chaos.
Mars.
Eris. Anyone guess what I named my daughter? My daughter is called Eris.
Oh my gosh.
And the goddess of chaos.
You too?
What?
Oh no, he said his name's Eric.
Oh, Eric. Someone called Eris here?
Eric.
Eric.
What?
I guess Eric might be the god of chaos.
That's right.
Eris is the war god's little sister. She goes ahead of the war god, sowing discord, right? Getting the enemies fighting among each other. So a mythos is a word coined to describe a style of explanation. You look at some part of the natural world and make up a story about how it got started. And the stories usually involve supernatural beings, beings that are not bound by the laws of nature that bind us, such as gods, frost giants, fire giants, demons, elves, fairies, what have you, goblins. In contrast to this, we have logos. And don't worry if your answers were different from this. There's a lot of right answers to these questions. Now, logos is a style of explanation by which something you see, like the rainbow, or the existence of chaos in society, avalanches, monkeys, any feature of the natural world, any observable, anything that you can see out there in the world, you try to explain it by something that in principle could someday be observed. An explanation that can be checked. Now, the first recorded person, first person we know about who did this kind of overt thinking, who went out and said, hey, I can explain that thing by these other things that we could go out and look at, is a guy called Thales, lived in Asia Minor. I think he might have been Greek, I'm not sure. And this is a radical departure from mythos, because mythos explanations cannot be checked. Given the fact that elves are elusive, can become invisible, and can cloud men's minds, can anyone come up with a way to definitively check the elves got him explanation for strokes? Can anyone here prove that it isn't elves?
No.
What?
No, there's no way you can prove it, because there's no arrow, there's nothing, it's just a
Right.
blood
Usually it's
vessel.
like-
This room could be crowded with elves, pointing at us and laughing. You know, there could be elves under every desk. There could be just hundreds and hundreds of elves hanging, and pixies and fairies flying around, and they're all laughing at us because we can't see them. Bastards. Those elves. You know what else? I mean, they could be doing all kinds of harm. It's not just stroke. They could be giving people heart attacks, rashes, colds. Have you ever had a cold and you don't know where it came from? It's probably an elf. Bloody elves. Right. Well, the next thing about logos explanations is they can be disproved. Thales tried to explain why the Nile floods in summer. I think it's summer. Nile floods in summer. Every other river floods in the winter. Why does the Nile flood in the summer but not the winter? Thales sat down and came up with an explanation. That was completely wrong. But it was a natural explanation. He said, oh, well, maybe it's the dry desert winds. They're drying out They're drying out the Nile during the winter, and then in the summer they die down and the Nile can fill up with water. That's an explanation that can be checked. You can send an expedition up the Nile and see what happens, and see if there are actually dry desert winds blowing around and doing what Thales thought they were doing. You can check these explanations. Now, one of the threads for this class, something to keep in the back of your head as we go along, is that we're not just describing the development of philosophy in terms of this guy said this, and then this guy said this, and this guy said, and the ideas got better and better as they got along. You know, philosophy has the same kind of development as physics. Modern philosophical doctrines are a lot more sound than ancient ones. They're on better ground, they're better thought out, they're more logical, they're better congruence with the evidence. But also, in this class, we're talking about the evolution of thought itself. We're talking about how thinking, ways of thinking about stuff, changed over time. And this is about the biggest change of all. The change from supernatural-based explanations, my invisible friend did it, to explanations that can be checked and which can be improved. You come up with a better theory that explains more. And this is really, what we're describing here is the basic skeleton of the scientific method. And the scientific method is behind pretty much everything we like about modern life. If you like digital cameras, thank science. If you like watches, thank science. If you like advanced metallurgy, thank science. If you like improved methods of producing and dyeing cotton, aniline dyes, high quality, high color fast dyes are a fairly recent phenomenon. Dye used to be very, very, very expensive, very, very hard to get. Good dyes, so all the colors of clothing now depends on science. Almost all of our technology depends directly on science. Do you know what a technology is? A technology is a way of doing something that achieves a goal. One of our most important technologies, a very old technology, but a very important technology, is hand washing. Doctors in hospitals and nurses in hospitals go through elaborate procedures to make sure that their hands are absolutely clean, scrubbing for 5 minutes. When you wash your hands, you are employing a technology. And the reason that hand washing is promoted in our society is because scientists decided that the best way to explain disease was little tiny, what they called amyloid germs, microbes, invisible animals and plants living on your skin that could grow and do icky stuff to you. So flu shots are a matter of technology. We haven't had a flu pandemic since 1919. You know that you heard about the flu pandemic after World War I? It killed more people than World War I. More people died of the flu the year after World War I than died in the whole war. It killed more people. But because nothing was blowing up, there were no explosions. Nobody, it really wasn't interesting. So, and now we have flu shots. We have flu vaccines that we get every year. So, the explanations of things can be improved over time. We can do more stuff. Now, I have a little thought experiment that I like to run. I want to compare two totally separate countries. Mytholia and Logoland.
Lego?
No, this is actually more fun than Legoland, but that's not hard. At the beginning of our stories, the inhabitants of Mytholia and Logoland are in basically the same state. They live in mud huts, and they have diseases. They die noisily. Life sucks. Now I want you to imagine that in Mytholia, the only kind of explanation that is allowed, the culture of Mytholia is we will use mythological explanations. They might call it science, they might call it reason, they might call it logic, but everything fits into Mytholia's set of supernatural beliefs. Everything in Mytholia is like scientific creationism or intelligent design. The answer is God did it, or the gods did it, or it says elves. Damn them. See him? Elves got him. Now I want you to imagine that 1,000 years passes. In this diagram, time moves downwards. What is Mytholia going to look like? What kind of society will Mytholia have? What kind of society will Logoland have?
Mud huts versus houses with running water.
Running water. Yes, they'll have running water. In Logoland, they'll have running water and they'll have green grass and I don't know.
They'll have tin huts.
Tin huts. They'll have skyscrapers.
Flying cars.
Flying cars. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
You know we had flying cars?
Kind of.
Yeah, back after World War II, they made a bunch of different kinds of flying cars. They all worked. Like 5 or 6 companies produced flying cars in various ways. There was a way you could drive your car onto the airport, and then they'd attach wings to it and a propeller, and then you could fly away. And there was another one where you fly your plane in and then fold your wings, and you could go on the ground. Why don't we do that anymore?
Ask John.
What?
Ask Kennedy.
No, you guys. People who, it's much easier to have, if you can afford a plane, you can afford a car as well.
Yeah, but
It's much
hard
easier to
fly
have a
it.
plane as a car than in something that doesn't do either job well.
It's too hard to fly it though.
Right. And they'll have spaceships, but no pollution. Right. Everything, they'll have variety, they'll have good stuff. It'll be like America in the movies. What's it going to be like in Mytholia?
Mud huts.
Pretty much the same. If they haven't had a religious war and killed themselves off, it'll be pretty much the same.
And actually in Legoland, or Logoland, sorry, there would be a hospital to fix people so they don't die.
Right. Be hospitals, be education. the
be all the
nubbies on
same
top of
stuff.
the building
But
for
then
the
it's-
logo Legos. So, alright. Now, um, now I'm a logocentrist. I like logos. Logos is good, mythos, yeah, you know, you want to go do that in the privacy of your own home. Just don't bother me with it. Okay, don't impose it on other people. Mythos is okay, it can be wonderful, people enjoy it, people feel that it gives meaning to their lives. That's fine, just don't push it on other people and don't use it to run the country. When I hear things like President Ronald Reagan would regularly consult an astrologer, I get the heebie-jeebies. I don't want my chief of state consulting a mythological source. So mythos, eh. Logos, good. Logos, good. Ah.
Yes, right away, exactly.
So that's logocentrism. A logocentrist is someone who puts logos above everything else. Everything has to fit into logos. Everything has to fit into this way of thinking where explanations can be checked and bad explanations should be rejected, and you use your imagination to come up with good explanations. All right. Now, one of the reasons for starting with mythos and logos is, of course, this is like where it started, where philosophy, science, technology, the possibility of having a modern world, where this all started. But another reason for starting with logos and mythos is to look at philosophical criticism. There's a process in philosophy where people offer doctrines. Those doctrines are criticized by other people. If the criticism works, the doctrine is knocked down and it'll be replaced by something else. If the criticism doesn't work, the doctrine continues. So, and any doctrine, any idea can be criticized. Part of learning how to do philosophy is learning how to look at a doctrine and then look at the criticisms and then think about, does that criticism really knock down the doctrine, or is it just totally misguided? And logos and mythos, the difference between logos and mythos, gives us actually two criticisms that, while I think they're ludicrous, are actually fairly easy to evaluate. So when I do this thing about criticizing logocentrism, I want you to do at least two things. I want you to understand the criticisms and how they can be knocked down, but I also want you to understand the process of criticizing doctrines. Basically, you are supposed to disagree. You are supposed to find ways in which the doctrines before you can be brought down, can be criticized. The philosophical doctrines that we have now are, in the main, ones that have been well tested. And this is particularly true in science. Science, modern scientific theories, have been very, very well tested. Very smart, independent people have tested those doctrines, and they haven't been able to find fatal flaws. That's the way science works. Argument, all the time argument. The same in philosophy. One criticism of logocentrism is the claim that logocentrism is also ethnocentrism. If someone goes to from the West to a third world country or a new world country and says, hey, we have this thing called logos and science and stuff, and it can improve your life. Look, better living through chemistry. What they're really doing is saying, my way is better than your way. I'm from the West, you're not, you're inferior, but you can improve your pathetic little life by dressing like me, adopting my religion, speaking my language, and being like me, and saying, taking up the scientific way of thought is just another way of saying, be an American. Be like the West. The other criticism says that Logos is just another mythos. It's just another mythological system, and not a very good one. Science talks about invisible entities, entities that do not form part of our everyday lives. How many of you have ever seen a quark? Well, an electron. How many of you have seen an electron? You know, I've got one we've got to be able to see one of them. There's billions of them here. An atom, seen an atom? How about a molecule? We believe in these things, but we can never see them. How many of you have ever seen the strong nuclear force? Have you ever seen electromagnetism? Not the effects of electromagnetism, but electromagnetism working between two atoms. You see, if you've held up a magnet and the magnet moves. Have you ever seen the lines of force between the magnet? You can see iron filings standing up, right? You can see the iron filings standing up, and we say, aha, there's magnetic lines of force there. But what we see are the iron filings standing up. And to Jung and Levi-Strauss, that's Jung and Levi-Strauss, well, that's just the same as saying, hey, there's little pixies that pick up the iron filings and put them in little piles. They're making sand castles. Right? There's just a lot of pixies there, and they happen to fly in every time. They like iron. Furthermore, right, when people heard the explanation of an elf stroke, the elves got him, it was emotionally satisfying. Mythological explanations are very, very comfortable to people. Scientific explanations are cold. Scientific explanations do not help us sleep better at night. And according to Jung and Levi-Strauss, science mystifies the world and tells us things that couldn't possibly be true. For instance, science tells us that this table is mostly empty space. And yet look, I can't move my hand through that empty space. So science is just not describing the world right. This is, of course, bullshit. There's a huge difference between the entities of science and the entities of mythos. You can check and manipulate the entities of science. Technology works, magic doesn't. Appeal to the elves. I don't like him. I wish he'd have a stroke. Any elves around here? What can I do for you? No. They will persuade you to give him a stroke. Actually, come on, it'd be a good way to take out your enemies. If you made friends with the elves, you'd be starving, man. Just imagine having an elf bodyguard. Someone takes a swing at you, they go, ah! You fall down. But despite my best efforts, elves have still not taken out my enemies. So, science is not trying to be a mythology. It is not trying to do the things that mythology does well. Logos is trying to do something else, a different domain. Ethnocentrism. This attitude kind of nauseates me. You guys know what ethnocentrism is? Ethnocentrism is when people of one culture decide that their culture must be better than other people's and try to force other people or coerce other people into fitting their culture. My favorite example is Hawaii. When the missionaries arrived in Hawaii, they found the guys surfing and the women walking around topless. So they banned surfing. Unfortunately, they also invented the muumuu. You know what a muumuu is? It's a device to stop Hawaiian women from walking around topless. So, why? Why did they do that? Well, because Europeans don't surf, so surfing is bad. Europeans walk around covered up, so walking around topless is bad. It doesn't fit my culture, therefore it's wrong. That's ethnocentrism. But that's not what logocentrism is. Logocentrism says that this style of explanation of explaining the observable with the observed with the observable, explaining the natural world with natural explanations, finding things that work, using, having ways of doing stuff that work, that achieve our goals, and discarding things that don't work. Don't do stuff that doesn't work. Logos isn't Western. The West has managed to associate it with itself with Logos because the West had the Industrial Revolution, which created economic and military power, led to Europe dominating the world. But at best, that puts Europe ahead of the curve. I don't know what the right word is, so I made one up. The West, Logos, the West isn't Logos. You know, the West isn't logorific. It doesn't always follow Logos. The West isn't as smart as it thinks it is. When the French took over Indochina, they abolished a very good education system and replaced it with a crappy one of their own. When Americans conquered Hawaii, they destroyed the Hawaiian ecological practices. The Hawaiians, the native Hawaiians, were the world's best ecologists. They had the best managed ecology on the planet. And the Westerners came in and buggered it all up. Logos is not really characteristic of the West. We have our own mythos. We still have lots and lots and lots of mythological beliefs. Quite apart from religion, we have fortune tellers, astrologers, psychic friends. I'm still laughing about the fact that Psychic Friends Network went out of business. You'd think they'd see it coming. Right? We have ghosts. We have all this uncheckable, unverifiable stuff, and we make up new words for it so that we can pretend we no longer believe in magic. There are actually a few synonyms in the world. English language. Can anyone remember the old word for psychic phenomena?
Crazy.
Magic. Dude, that's what we used to call magic. We make up a lot of words for it, new words for it, but that's what it is. We have all kinds of mythological beliefs here in the West. Some of them utterly bizarre. Look out at the rest of the world and you'll find Logos operating everywhere. Logos is not exclusively Western. And when I say I think Logos is good, I'm saying the West should be logical. Does anyone remember what Gandhi said when a reporter asked him what he thought of Western civilization? Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?
I need food.
He replied, I think it would be a good idea. One person got that. You guys should start being civilized. So, Logos isn't a form of ethnocentrism. Yes, people have done ethnocentrism in the guise of Logos. One of the greatest crimes committed in the 20th century was the Nestle Corporation dressed salespeople up in white coats to pretend that they were medical professionals and went into villages in Africa and advised women to quit breastfeeding their babies and start buying infant formula instead. Well, even under the best conditions, infant formula is a poor substitute for breast milk. But in the conditions of these villages where you could not get perfectly clean water and the people could not afford an adequate supply of breast milk, the switch of infant formula, the switch from breastfeeding to formula killed tens of thousands of babies. It made just about every one of them sick. It had a health impact on everyone. Some of them died. This is why some people I know still boycott the Nestle Corporation. They kill babies, dude. Anyway, they pretended to be Logos. They were lying about it. They were trying to exploit these people for personal profit. Had nothing to do with Logos or mythos. It really didn't have anything to do with capitalism. It was just plain, flat fraud. Okay. So, I think it's pretty easy to show that Logos is not just another mythos. True, it does not work well as a mythology. You can't tell bedtime stories based on quantum mechanics. God knows I've tried. No, I haven't. But you can't. So whatever it is that mythos does for us, and mythos actually arguably does a hell of a lot for us, science can't do that. Logos can't do that. Philosophy can't do what mythos does for us. But it does what it does, and it does it very well. It does a different thing. Logos is not ethnocentric. If you're promoting Logos, you are trying to reform and change the West as much as you're trying to change and reform any other part of the world. The West is lucky, it's ahead of the curve. Does anyone know the exact country that the Industrial Revolution started in? Scotland. It all started in Scotland. Then it percolated out over the rest of Europe. But Logos isn't really Western. If you look at the history of just about any country, of any culture, you will find times when they did science, and sometimes their science was in advance of the West. Yes, the West has cultural differences. There were cultural differences that made the West, some of the countries in the West, more congenial to science. But it was the Arabs who saved mathematics. It was the Arabs who saved Aristotle from the Dark Ages. So if us white Anglo-Saxon ex-Protestant Caucasian start saying, "Oh, yeah, we're so smart," it's just rubbish. There isn't a basis for saying the West is better. So promoting Logos is not the same as promoting Western civilization. Okay, any questions? Any questions apart from can we get out of here? All right, you can go.